Mortimer McAllister wasn't your typical werewolf. He didn't snarl or stalk hapless victims through the foggy streets, well, not frequently at least. He was a mild-mannered office assistant by day and a secret sweater enthusiast by night, especially when the moon was full and bright. In the small town of Pine Grove, nobody suspected Mortimer to be anything other than an unremarkable resident who always wore alarmingly patterned sweaters. Those sweater designs were the envy of the local yarn shop regulars. But while the townsfolk admired his knit creations, no one realized the bizarre lengths he went to in order to produce them. Of course, he suspected that one day the secret of his nighttime transformations and the reason behind his massive yarn orders would catch up with him. It all started several years ago when Mortimer was on a solo camping trip in the dense, moonlit forest near Pine Grove. The break was meant to clear his head after a stressful quarter at the small marketing firm where he worked. Instead, on that fateful night, he was bitten by a stray werewolf who had apparently gotten lost on its own quest for answers or maybe fresh squirrels. The details were fuzzy, but by the next full moon, Mortimer discovered that his complexion wasn't just pale from the daily office grind. He sprouted fur, roared at the top of his lungs, and rampaged around his tiny apartment until he wore himself out. But amid the chaos, he discovered something equally surprising. He had, in his newly hairy hands, a half-knit sweater. It turned out that in the midst of his growling and raging, his transformed mind had latched onto some old knitting needles in a forgotten craft box. Rather than tearing the place apart, he found comfort in loops and pearls. When dawn came, he woke up surrounded by yarn, newly crocheted potholders, and a nearly finished sweater. He had no recollection of how or why. A month later, during the next full moon, it happened again. At first, he was certain something was seriously wrong with him, beyond the normal, I turn into a ferocious beast once a month. As nights went on, though, Mortimer recognized that while most werewolves howled under the moon's spell, he seemed compelled to knit, and not just amateur scarves, but truly beautiful pieces. Pattern after pattern, design after design, his monstrous mind was a wizard with a pair of knitting needles. Of course, Mortimer tried normal ways of coping with werewolf life at first. He considered chaining himself up, scheduling a trip to remote caves, or even joining an underground support group for supernatural curiosities. But each tactic failed once the full moon rose, and the unstoppable desire to cast on a new sweater overcame him. He'd rummage for the nearest yarn and knit until the break of dawn, whereupon he'd wake surrounded by multicolored masterpieces. Rather than fight it, he leaned in. If he was going to be a werewolf, he might as well have the best-dressed neighbors in town and never have to buy another cardigan again. He quickly realized another perk. Knitting gave him a great cover story for explaining away any suspicious stuff. When neighbors questioned why he was always cooped up inside on full moon nights, he just shrugged, pointed to a freshly completed cardigan, and said he was deep in creative focus. The only snag was that the more sweaters he produced, the more local gossip swirled about where on earth he got all that yarn. There were concerned whispers that Mortimer might be unraveling rugs from the local library or pilfering from the thrift store's blanket bin. In truth, Mortimer had established a covert relationship with an online yarn shop that offered doorstep delivery at odd hours. He had packages come after midnight to avoid prying eyes. It didn't always work. Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down had once spotted a suspiciously fluffy box on his porch in the wee hours. As nights turned to mornings and sweaters stacked higher in his living room, Mortimer felt the pinch of secrecy. Strange occurrences trailed him. He'd patch up a stray hole in a sweater only to discover odd footprints in the yard. The mailman once delivered a letter to Mortimer's door claiming it looked like a giant dog had scrawled all over the mailbox in multicolored spool threads. The poor postal worker couldn't figure out that it was just Mortimer's overwrought attempt to practice decorative crocheting in a moment of half-lucid werewolf mania. To keep up appearances, Mortimer occasionally donated surplus sweaters to a local charity, claiming his aunt was a prolific knitter, spinning up garments for the needy. He hoped no one would notice that his aunt's design style matched the sweaters Mortimer himself wore every day. Trouble brewed one crisp autumn. Pine Grove's annual Harvest Festival approached, featuring a grand knitting contest sponsored by the local yarn shop. The winner's prize sweater would be displayed in the town square for everyone to admire. For Mortimer, this was simultaneously thrilling and horrifying. On one hand, how could he resist showing off what he could do with a set of needles during a particularly energetic full moon? On the other, if he participated, someone might connect the dots between his uncanny skill and the bizarre sightings of a large, fuzzy figure prowling around with bundles of yarn at midnight. Yet the temptation was strong. After all, the contest offered a year's supply of the best, softest wool. With that, Mortimer would never again need to scramble after subpar synthetic threads that made his fur itch. He reasoned that maybe, this time, he could take advantage of his monthly transformation. He set out to design the most marvelous sweater Pine Grove had ever seen, something that would outshine the pastel cardigans and grandmotherly shawls the town typically paraded. During the day, Mortimer sketched designs in secret at his desk job, constantly flicking over to spreadsheets whenever his boss passed by. By night, he downed cups of chamomile tea to calm his nerves, waiting for the full moon to guide his supernatural knitting instincts. With each day, the harvest festival crept closer, and Mortimer's excitement and fear mounted. When the fateful full moon night arrived, Mortimer prepared meticulously. He laid out piles of yarn in every imaginable shade of blues, greens, and silver. He placed his premium knitting needles on the coffee table, along with a pattern that danced in his imagination like a dream. Then he waited, anxious for the moon's glow to trigger his transformation. A few hours later, the fur crept over his arms, his bones popped in the painful process, and his sense of smell grew unimaginably powerful. A typical werewolf might howl to the night sky. Mortimer simply grabbed the needles. He knitted with a ferocity that matched his beastly nature. Click-clack, click-clack, the rhythmic sound of needle on needle replaced the roars of monstrous anger. Bundles of yarn turned into intricate cables and patterns, roped together in harmonious design. The creature's oversized paws zipped through the pattern with startling speed, as though possessed by a tailor's spirit. By dawn, Mortimer collapsed onto the couch in pure exhaustion, knitted sweater draped around his shoulders like a piece of freshly spun magic. When he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he gasped. The garment was stunning, a swirl of emerald green and midnight blue, shot through with specks of silver that captured the essence of the moonlit forest. In the center, a subtle motif of intertwining wolves lay hidden, so faint that you had to look closely to see it. Mortimer was beyond proud and a little terrified. Any knitter in Pine Grove would gawk at this masterpiece, but now that it existed, there was no backing out. He had to enter the sweater in the contest. Staying out of the public eye was no longer an option if he wanted to satisfy that deep creative itch the moon so powerfully awakened. The harvest festival day bloomed bright and breezy. Mortimer showed up at the fairgrounds wearing one of his older, less conspicuous sweaters, a neon pink affair with daisies that was still too memorable for his comfort. He clutched his prized design in a garment bag, hoping that every rustle of the crowd wouldn't reveal a thread of evidence about his transformation. The contest table was surrounded by crocheters and knitters chatting about yarn tension and bragging about their newest baby blankets. Mortimer tiptoed around, offering forced smiles to Mrs. Henderson, who was rumored to have a shawl so delicate it looked like lace spun by mystical fairies. Then arrived Francine Gable, widely recognized as Pine Grove's sweater-knitting prodigy, sporting an enormous plum-colored creation complete with ruffled collar and embroidered grapevines. Mortimer gulped, half in awe and half in terror. When it came time to present his piece, Mortimer's hands shook. He slipped the sweater out of its bag, and the crowd gasped. Initially, a hush fell over the entire square, then the oohs and ahs erupted in waves. Even Francine, normally unimpressed by anyone else's craft, bit her lip and grudgingly nodded. The judge's three fearless elders who had been knitting since well before Mortimer was born frowned in concentration as they peered at the intricacies of his design. Their brows furrowed in a mixture of admiration and confusion. "How," asked Ethel, the head judge, "did you manage those perfectly symmetrical cables around the shoulders?" Mortimer's heart pounded. Um, he stammered. Lots of practice and a special technique? He prayed nobody noticed his sweaty brow or the slight tremor in his left hand, which still twitched from the werewolf's powerful knitting barrage. In an act that felt excruciatingly long, the judges examined each entry in detail. Crowds meandered from booth to booth, admiring crocheted blankets, fingerless gloves, and a wide array of cozy mufflers. Mortimer spent the day second-guessing himself, checking the position of the sun, counting how many hours remained until nightfall. In a twist of scheduling cruelty, the contest winners would be announced at dusk. Would he still be here under the bright lights when the moon rose? Would any suspicious watchers catch him if his hair began to sprout? He paced around the fairgrounds, sampling caramel apples and politely chatting with neighbors who said things like, "Morty, can you help me with a custom sweater for my bulldog?" He nodded with forced politeness, all the while scanning the horizon for any sign of that dreadful yet strangely comforting moon. Finally, as the sky turned orange and pink, the moment arrived. Ethel stepped onto a small wooden stage. She cleared her throat into the microphone and began reading the results. Third place went to Miss Maisie for her knitted stuffed vegetables. Second place, Mr. Barnaby for his crocheted tractor blanket. Mortimer swallowed hard, he hoped. Think of that, he might come in second too. That way he could squeak out of the spotlight. But that dream dissolved as Ethel announced first place. Mortimer McAllister for his extraordinary sweater that masterfully captures the beauty of nature. Applause thundered in the square. Mortimer felt his heart simultaneously swell with pride and plunge into panic. Under the cheers, he ambled up to the stage, forced to grin, and accepted the blue ribbon with shaking hands. Cameras flashed, well-wishers congratulated him, and Ethel pinned the ribbon onto his neon pink daisies. Adrenaline pumping, Mortimer saw the faint glow of the rising moon peeking above the horizon. Panic buzzed in every fiber of his being. He clutched the ribbon, uncertain whether to sprint home or maintain composure for the community. The last place he wanted to be was on a stage, morphing under the astonished gaze of half the town. Summoning a courage he didn't realize he possessed, Mortimer mumbled a quick acceptance speech. I'm honored, thank you, excuse me. He dashed off the stage, ignoring shouts to pose for pictures and interviews. One particularly persistent local reporter, Gina Montgomery, pursued him with a notepad and camera in hand, determined to get an exclusive. He hightailed it beneath the festival lights, weaving through stalls, ignoring the tempting smell of hot cider until he found a deserted corner behind the funnel cake cart. Slumping against a fence post, he felt the inevitable surge, nails lengthening, teeth sharpening, the uncontrollable urge to purl. He tried to leave his knitting bag at home, but in a last-minute panic had brought a portable kit just in case. Now, as fur crept across his arms, Mortimer cursed himself for not controlling his compulsion better. He rummaged inside the bag for the small circular needles he carried for emergencies, but in that moment, a flash went off. He looked up. Gina stood there, camera raised, eyes wide. She gaped as Mortimer's face elongated into a snout covered with silver fur. The secret was out. Horrified, she stumbled back, dropping her notepad onto the dusty ground. Mortimer wanted to say something, but his newly formed muzzle only produced a low growl that reverberated in the chilly evening air. Expecting screams, Mortimer braced himself. Instead, Gina's jaw dropped a moment longer, and then she slowly raised her camera. "This is outstanding," she gasped. "You're a werewolf! That knits!" She took another photo, each flash making Mortimer flinch. Instinct told him to run, to vanish into the forest, never to show his face in Pine Grove again. But the knitting needles in his hand told another story. He realized in his beastly haze that the unstoppable desire to knit still burned fiercely within him. He sank onto the bench, his claws fumbling with the yarn. A bizarre hush fell between them as Gina watched the monstrous figure carefully begin a new row of neat, even stitches. She lowered her camera and took cautious steps forward. I'm not sure if I should be terrified or thoroughly impressed," she admitted, voice trembling. A strangled, guttural sound emerged from Mortimer's throat. Something akin to, "Sorry, I can't stop." He was vaguely aware of the carnival sounds continuing on the other side of the booths, of children squealing on the Ferris wheel, of the band playing polka near the cider stand. Here, behind the funnel cake cart, a paparazzi showdown unfolded between a werewolf and a local reporter. Before Gina could fully process her amazement, Mortimer whipped up a swirl of stitches that formed the start of a small dizzying pattern. Despite his monstrous state, a gentle look gleamed in his glowing amber eyes. Slowly, Gina edged closer, her fear replaced by curiosity. "You're not going to, maul me?" she asked warily. He shook his shaggy head, letting out a soft whine. "I just knit," he managed, forcing his thick tongue around the words. The rest of that surreal evening passed in a blur. Luckily for Mortimer, Gina hadn't exactly prepared for an interview with a werewolf. She did her best to remain calm, and in exchange, Mortimer tried not to drool on her expensive camera lens. With shaky hands, Gina offered him a donut from a nearby booth, which he gingerly nibbled on between stitch sets. The transformation was still in full effect. He was fully wolfish in appearance, yet impressively docile thanks to being preoccupied with knitting. Night deepened, but the festival's lights stayed bright. Gina explained she wanted to do a story, but Mortimer whined in protest, trying to convey that his entire life would unravel if everyone knew. She raised an eyebrow. "You won first place. Sooner or later, people will notice if you vanish every full moon." Mortimer's ears flattened, but he nodded in resignation, trembling at the thought. However, Gina seemed unexpectedly empathetic. She pitched him an idea. She wouldn't reveal his identity outright, but she could write a piece about a mysterious lunar knitter who blessed Pine Grove with unbelievably stylish sweaters. If the rumor was that he was a secret werewolf, people would read it as charming local folklore. "They'll never guess it's you," she promised. Mortimer stared, muzzle half open. Was it possible? Could this arrangement allow him to keep working in the day, transform in private, and still share his lunar crafts with the town? It was unorthodox, but so was a werewolf who knitted. With no better option, he bobbed his shaggy head again in agreement. Gina, trembling with excitement, instructed him to pick a discreet location to meet next month, some moonlit clearing near the lake, and she'd snap photos of the knitting werewolf from a respectable distance. "We'll call you the Wolf of Wall Street, or something catchy," she exclaimed. In the following weeks, life in Pine Grove settled back into its usual rhythms. Everyone still congratulated Mortimer on his big contest win, completely unaware of the supernatural meltdown that had taken place behind the funnel cake stand. He politely deflected interview requests by claiming to be camera shy. When Mrs. Henderson asked if he saw anything strange at the festival, Mortimer feigned ignorance. Meanwhile, the local newspapers ran Gina's article featuring a grainy photo of a tall, furry silhouette hunched over what appeared to be knitting needles. Titled simply "Lunar Knits, Fact or Fiction," the piece described an alleged sighting of a werewolf-like figure deeply engrossed in crafting a sweater by moonlight. Predictably, half the town dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, while the other half found it an absolute riot. Yarn shops reported an unusual spike in interest from curious folks wanting to replicate the werewolf sweater. Mortimer secretly delighted in knowing his hidden hobby was behind the trend. Each month, under the moon's beam, Mortimer and Gina carried out their carefully orchestrated plan. She brought her camera and a notepad, staying a respectful distance away from the knitting flurry. Mortimer brought skeins of the finest yarn he could find, letting his inner beast shape the designs. Gina's articles grew more colorful, weaving a myth about a misunderstood creature who roamed the outskirts of Pine Grove, leaving behind unbelievably snug creations. She never revealed Mortimer's name or face. Over time, as fearful rumors softened into whimsical legend, townsfolk began leaving small gifts on the outskirts of the local forests. A basket of wool here, a tin of cookies there, hoping to glimpse the Wolf of Wall Street. And sometimes, if they were lucky, they might spot a shadowy figure dash between the trees, wearing a half-finished shawl across its furry shoulders. For Mortimer, life had never been more fulfilling. He still had the occasional moment of panic, like when he forgot to tuck away a half-knitted wolf beanie before a neighbor dropped by for tea, but overall, he found balance. By day, he typed up marketing proposals and answered phones, politely ignoring coworkers who kept inviting him to go out for drinks at night. By night on those special, bright nights, he let his fur run wild, accompanied by the comforting, rhythmic click of metal needles. Over time, he even discovered that focusing on knitting during his transformations made them less painful, as if channeling the beast's strength into art soothed his savage instincts. Eventually, the yearly harvest festival rolled around once more. Mortimer thought about defending his title by creating another elaborate garment, but this time, to avoid suspicion, he entered a simpler sweater under a pseudonym, LK for Lunar Knits. To his relief, he came in a modest second place, enough to keep his reputation as a skilled knitter alive without hogging the local spotlight again. Meanwhile, the Lunar Knits legend was more popular than ever. Families spun tall tales about supernaturally cozy blankets woven by a friendly wolf at midnight. The mayor jokingly declared a full moon sweater day each month, encouraging residents to wear their warmest, wildest knits in tribute to the elusive creature. And so, Mortimer's double life continued in a comfortable loop. He stayed a werewolf, of course, forever changed by that fateful bite in the moonlit woods, but he found a place in the community that was strangely welcoming of his unusual pastime, even if they never knew it was him behind those yarn-laden nights. He felt a measure of peace whenever he heard someone gush about the mythical knitting werewolf of Pine Grove. Sometimes on a quiet morning, Mortimer would see a group of kids sprinting through the park, wearing bright sweaters with embroidered paw prints on the sleeves. They giggled and howled for fun, pretending to be what they called the cuddliest werewolf ever. He'd smile knowingly to himself, content with his unique secret. Yes, Mortimer occasionally wondered what might happen if the truth spilled out entirely. Perhaps the community that embraced the myth might recoil if they discovered the everyday man behind the knitting needles, but for now, everything was humming along quite nicely. The night of the full moon would come, the transformation would take hold, and Mortimer's biggest concern would be whether he had enough yarn for that new pattern. After all, a werewolf stash was never large enough, and if you happened to walk through the forest at midnight, you might hear not a howl echoing through the pines, but the furious clack-clack of needles. And if you were really lucky, you might catch a glimpse of a furry figure, tail wrapped in the glow of the moon, quietly stitching another masterpiece.